Most organizations think Azure gets expensive because engineers waste money. They are wrong. Azure gets expensive because the platform is allowed to spend without an owner, without limits, and without consequences. That isn't a savings problem. It's cost entropy, drift created by unowned deployment pathways that keep producing recurring spend long after the original decision got forgotten. This episode isn't dashboards, savings hacks, or spot VM folklore. It's the uncomfortable shift from why is Azure expensive to the only question that matters: what did you allow and why can nobody stop it? The enterprise cost failure mode, unowned spend becomes normal. Cost overruns don't show up as one dramatic mistake. They show up as a new normal, a temporary environment that never gets deleted because nobody can prove it's safe. A premium SKU chosen for safety because the engineer is accountable for outages, not for invoices. Silent egress during a migration because the network path changed, the data moved, and the bill kept arriving. None of these are exotic failures. They are the default behavior of a large Azure estate when intent is not enforced. Here's what most people miss. Every one of those outcomes is locally rational. The engineer wants a stable deployment, so they select the higher tier. The team wants velocity, so they clone the environment and come back later to clean up. The platform team wants to unblock delivery, so they grant broad permissions temporarily. Each decision makes sense in isolation, but the enterprise doesn't pay for isolated decisions. The enterprise pays for the aggregate, and that aggregate becomes chaos because cloud cost is not additive in the way leaders imagine. It is compounding. It accumulates from recurring resources, from idle capacity, from just-in-case redundancy, from shared services nobody can allocate, and from the quiet truth that Azure is a permissioned system. If something exists, some identity was allowed to create it. This is the part that should sound familiar to security people. Security drift doesn't happen because everyone suddenly forgets security. It happens because exceptions accumulate. A conditional access policy gets an exclude for this service account. An RBAC role gets a temporary owner. A firewall rule gets a one-day opening that survives 3 quarters. Over time, the system stops behaving deterministically and starts behaving probabilistically. Cost follows the same physics. If the platform allows teams to create resources without ownership metadata, without budget boundaries, and without constrained SKU choices, then drift is not a risk. Drift is guaranteed. You are operating a cost system with no memory of intent. That distinction matters. The typical enterprise response is predictable. Reminders. We need to be more cost conscious. Please tag your resources. Here's the monthly cost review deck. That approach feels mature because it looks organized, but awareness does not constrain behavior. It never did. Reminders don't close deployment pathways. They don't stop a pipeline from deploying a premium database tier. They don't prevent a team from creating yet another subscription because procurement takes too long. They don't shut down an abandoned environment on Friday night. Humans are not a control plane. The platform is, Azure Resource Manager is, RBAC is, Azure Policy is, subscription boundaries are. Those are the things that decide what can exist and what cannot. If those layers do not encode financial intent, then the enterprise is basically running a distributed spending engine with no enforcement mechanism. So define the failure mode precisely. Unowned spend becomes normal because the system tolerates it. It tolerates resources that can't be attributed to a product, a cost center, or a named owner. It tolerates platform spend smeared across shared subscriptions where nobody feels it. It tolerates environments that outlive the sprint they were created for. It tolerates premium defaults, because nothing in the platform says prove you need this. And then eventually finance sees the invoice. By that point, the spend is no longer a decision. It's debt. The service is running. The stakeholders are attached. The architecture has formed around it. Turning it off is now a risk discussion, not a cost discussion. That's why invoice time escalation fails. It's always late and it's always political. Cost entropy is the name for that trap. It is unmanaged pathways that generate recurring spend without decision review. It is the gradual conversion of cost control from a deterministic model where spending happens because someone explicitly intended it, into a probabilistic one, where spending happens because the platform is allowed to do whatever it can. And if you're wondering why waste cleanup never seems to finish, this is why. You are chasing symptoms after the authorization decision already happened. The uncomfortable truth is simple. The enterprise cost failure mode is not the existence of waste. It's the absence of enforceable ownership. Waste is just what unowned systems produce at scale. And that's why most enterprises start FinOps backwards. They start with visibility tools, dashboards, and reports, and then wonder why behavior doesn't change. Visibility doesn't enforce intent. Governance does. FinOps implemented backwards, tooling first, governance never. Most enterprises do FinOps the same way they do security awareness. They buy tooling, build dashboards, schedule a review meeting, and then act surprised when behavior doesn't change. The usual sequence is almost scripted. First, enable Azure Cost Management, then build reports, then export to Power BI, then argue about amortization, reservations, and whether the spend should be grouped by resource group, subscription, or tag. Somewhere in the middle, someone adds an email alert at 90% of budget. Everyone feels responsible. Nobody is constrained. That distinction matters. Observability is not governance. Observability tells you what happened. Governance decides what can happen. FinOps implemented backwards confuses the two and calls it progress. This is why so many FinOps programs turn into cost theater. The reports get prettier, the decks get longer, the conversations get more sophisticated. But the platform remains permissive, so the spend keeps happening, and the FinOps team becomes a translation layer between invoices and engineers who never had to feel the cost decision in the moment it was made. Here's the uncomfortable behavior pattern that follows. Alerts become noise. Budget alert hits, email goes out, nobody responds. Not because people are lazy, because the alert is not attached to an owner with authority and consequence. The budget doesn't change anything. It doesn't block a deployment. It doesn't require an exception. It doesn't trigger escalation with teeth. It just creates another message in a mailbox already full of messages that sound urgent. And when alerts don't trigger action, engineers learn the real policy. Ignore it. That is how cost entropy becomes a culture problem. Not because the people are irresponsible, but because the system trains them that nothing happens when you exceed intent. The platform keeps running, the invoice arrives later. Somebody else argues about it. FinOps tooling is good at telling you where the money went. It is structurally bad at preventing the next dollar, unless you connect it to controls that shape deployment pathways. Most organizations don't. They treat cost tooling as the control plane when it's just telemetry. And nowhere does that failure hide better than shared services. Shared services is where cost accountability goes to die. Networking, logging, monitoring, security tooling, egress, private endpoints, everything that platform teams deploy in the name of standardization and safety. It's also the perfect place for the organization to stop asking who owns spend, because the answer is uncomfortable. Nobody owns it. Everyone depends on it. So it becomes central IT spend, and central IT becomes a cost sink. Every application team benefits, but no application team sees a direct bill. Therefore, nobody has an incentive to question retention, sampling, SKU tiers, or whether that cross-region log ingestion was actually required. The system behaves exactly as designed. Shared costs become invisible costs. Then finance asks why cloud is expensive, and the platform team shows a dashboard. The foundational mistake is treating the cost problem like a visibility problem. Visibility is necessary. It is never sufficient. A dashboard does not create a boundary. A report does not create a consequence. A monthly review does not stop a pipeline from deploying a premium tier on Tuesday morning because the engineer wants to reduce operational risks. So the FinOps meeting becomes a recurring ritual where everyone agrees something should change, and then the system keeps doing what it's allowed to do. That's the key phrase, what it's allowed to do. Because the only place you can reliably change cost behavior at scale is the control plane: identity, policy, hierarchy, and permissions. Azure doesn't spend money. Your authorization model spends money. The moment you accept that, the whole tooling-first approach looks like putting a speedometer in a car and calling it braking. It's useful information. It is not control. FinOps implemented correctly starts from a different question. Where is the enterprise allowing spend to occur without explicit intent? And how does the platform enforce that intent every time? That means budgets aren't just numbers. They're signals wired to owners. Tagging isn't etiquette. It's enforced metadata. SKU selection isn't preference, it's policy. Subscription creation isn't convenience. It's a gated act with declared accountability. In other words, cost isn't a finance artifact you observe after the fact. It's a control plane outcome you either constrained by design or you didn't. And once you see cost that way, the next step becomes obvious. Every cloud dollar is an authorization decision. The reframe. Every cloud dollar is an authorization decision. Here's the reframe that makes everything else painfully obvious. A cloud bill is not a finance event, it's a runtime side effect of authorization. Before a dollar shows up on an invoice, something had to be created, scaled, or left running. And before that could happen, the platform evaluated and allowed deny decisions somewhere in the graph. A user, a service principal, a managed identity, a pipeline, a landing zone automation account. Azure didn't get expensive. Azure did what it was allowed to do. That distinction matters because it moves the conversation away from feelings and toward mechanics. Cost isn't a behavior you inspire, it's a pathway you permit. If a resource exists, some identity had enough permission to create it, and the hierarchy had enough openness to accept it. So basically, every cloud dollar begins life as an authorization decision. Most enterprises pretend cost starts in cost management. It does not. Cost starts at deploy time and scale time. Cost starts when the system compiles intent into reality. RBAC allows the action, policy allows the configuration, and the subscription boundary absorbs the blast radius. Think of Azure like an authorization compiler. You write intent as code: ARM templates, bicep, Terraform, pipelines, portal clicks. The control plane evaluates that intent against rules. If it passes, the platform materializes capacity that burns money every hour until something stops it. If you want cost control, you don't need more visibility, you need tighter compilation rules. This is also why anonymous spending is the most dangerous anti-pattern in Azure. Anonymous spending isn't literally anonymous. Azure logs everything. Billing has line items. The issue is that the enterprise can't map spend to a responsible decision maker in time to intervene. The cost is smeared across shared scopes, or resources are created without enforceable ownership metadata, or the owner left the company and the budget stayed. That's not a reporting gap. That's an authorization gap, because cost control only works when the decision maker is inside the feedback loop. If engineering can deploy without owning the financial impact, you've built a system where accountability is optional. Optional accountability doesn't survive scale. Now here's the weird part. The more exceptions you allow, the less predictable cost control becomes. Enterprises love exceptions because they sound pragmatic. This workload is special. This team is blocked. We'll fix it later. And each exception converts your financial control model from deterministic to probabilistic. Deterministic means if you try to deploy X, the platform will deny it unless you meet Y. Probabilistic means sometimes X is denied, sometimes it passes, depending on who asked, what scope they used, which subscription they found, which policy is actually assigned, and which exemption was quietly granted 6 months ago. That isn't governance, that's conditional chaos. So what is financial intent in architectural terms? It's not a spreadsheet, it's not a forecast. It's a set of constraints the platform enforces continuously. Ownership. Every deployable scope has a named accountable party. Boundaries, budgets, and thresholds exist where ownership exists. Constraints, allowed SKUs, regions, and patterns match the environment's purpose. Escalation. When spend deviates, something happens that is not an email. Financial intent is the enterprise's decision logic, encoded where decisions actually happen. And once you accept that cost is authorization, you also accept something else. FinOps lives with identity, policy, RBAC, and hierarchy. Not because finance wants to be technical, but because that's where enforcement lives. Cost management can tell you what happened. It can't stop the next deployment. Azure policy can. .RBAC can. A subscription boundary can. Exception governance can. This is why the enterprise should stop talking about saving money and start talking about removing unaudited spending pathways. Savings is a byproduct, control is the goal. And if you want one practical implication to hold on to, if you can't point to the exact boundary where spend is owned and constrained, you don't have financial governance. You have financial hope. So the question becomes, where is the first boundary that actually works at enterprise scale? It isn't a resource group, it isn't a tag, it isn't a dashboard. It's the subscription. Subscriptions are the primary cost governance boundary. Most people treat subscriptions as billing buckets, a place to put workloads, a line item you can move later. That mental model is why cost control fails. A subscription is not primarily a finance construct. It's a governance boundary where 3 things collide: RBAC scope, policy scope, and a measurable financial blast radius. It is the first place where you can make ownership real, because the platform can attach permissions, budgets, and policy enforcement to a scope that actually contains damage. Resource groups don't do that, not reliably. Resource groups are operational containers. They help you organize. They help you deploy. They do not protect you from a team creating a second resource group with a different set of tags, a different naming convention, and a slightly different temporary story. And they absolutely don't protect you from the oldest enterprise trick: burying expensive shared services in a resource group nobody wants to touch. Management groups are higher level governance. They're necessary for scale, but they're not where cost accountability becomes personal. They're where standards get inherited. The place where spend becomes owned is lower, where budgets and permissions map to actual teams. That's the subscription. A well-designed subscription is a budget boundary first. It's the unit where you can say, this is the maximum financial exposure we will tolerate for this workload or this team, and if it exceeds expected behavior, escalation happens immediately. Not at invoice time, at deviation time. A subscription is also an RBAC boundary. If you want to stop anonymous spending, you need to stop handing out broad contributor at scopes where nobody can be clearly blamed. Subscriptions let you define who can deploy, who can approve, who can see costs, and who can grant further rights. That separation matters because otherwise the same identity that can create spend can also hide it. And a subscription is a policy boundary. Azure policy assignments at subscription scope are where enforcement stops being aspirational. You can deny premium SKUs in dev, you can restrict regions, you can require tags, you can force diagnostic settings that you've decided you're willing to pay for. You can also carve exceptions with visibility and expiration instead of letting them live forever as silent entropy generators. Now look at the failure mode most enterprises live in: subscription sprawl. Subscriptions get created ad hoc. A team needs a sandbox, so they create one. Another team needs a POC, so they create one. The platform team needs to unblock delivery, so they create one. Over time, you get dozens or hundreds of subscriptions with inconsistent policies, inconsistent tagging, inconsistent permissions, and no coherent budget story. And when the bill spikes, nobody knows where to look first, Because the sprawl wasn't just more subscriptions, it was more unreviewed pathways for spend, more identities, more places where policies weren't assigned, more corners where a high-tier resource could hide for months. So the real principle is not use fewer subscriptions. The principle is a subscription should not exist without declared intent. That means subscription creation is not a convenience. It's a governance event. It is the moment you decide who owns this, what it can spend, what it is allowed to deploy, and what happens when it deviates. Call it a vending model if you want. The name doesn't matter. The enforcement does. Before a subscription is issued, 4 things must be true. First, there is an accountable owner. A human name, not platform team, not a distribution list, a role with escalation responsibility when budgets fire. Second, there is a budget with early thresholds, not 90% at month end early. 50% and 75% are governance interrupts, not failure notices. Third, there are allowed SKUs and regions aligned to purpose. Dev is not prod. Non-prod doesn't get premium defaults just in case. Regions are constrained because global sprawl is both expensive and operationally chaotic. Fourth, there is an escalation workflow that actually routes. If a budget triggers, it creates a ticket, it pages the owner, it hits the right channel. Something happens that forces a decision. This is the point. Subscriptions turn cost governance from a vague aspiration into an enforceable boundary. When you do this, sprawl collapses into an intentional structure. And that structure is the only thing that lets you scale Azure without scaling financial chaos. Which brings up the first scenario. What happens when you don't do any of this? Scenario 1, subscription sprawl with no ownership. Here's what subscription sprawl looks like in a real enterprise, not the PowerPoint version, the lived version. There are dozens of subscriptions because every project needed just one more. Some were created by central IT, some by app teams, some by an MSP, some by whoever still had the rights. A few are tied to products, many aren't. And the ones that aren't become the perfect hiding place for spend because ambiguity is a financial shelter. In the before posture, budgets are either missing or decorative. Cost management exists, sure, but nobody owns the interpretation. Tags might exist, but they aren't enforced, and the billing views are full of resources with blank owners or TBD cost centers. There's usually at least one shared subscription called something like platform, connectivity, or hub, and it contains everything expensive and unglamorous. Firewalls, VPN gateways, private endpoints, log ingestion, cross-region replication, security tooling, the stuff that always grows and nobody wants to explain. And here's the operational pattern. Anomalies are discovered at invoice time. Finance sees a spike. It escalates to IT forwards it to the cloud team. The cloud team opens cost analysis and starts doing archaeology. Who created the resources? Why are they still running? Which subscription is this even in? Is this production? Is this a POC? Is it safe to delete? The answer is usually nobody knows. Not because the logs are missing, because ownership was never declared in a way the platform could enforce. So the system is full of spend that is technically attributable, but practically unowned. That's the pathology. The organization can see cost, but cannot assign responsibility fast enough to intervene. So every month becomes the same ritual. Finance wants a name. Engineering wants proof it's safe to change. The platform team wants to avoid breaking workloads it doesn't own. And leadership wants the bill to stop growing without having to learn what a private endpoint is. Over time, the enterprise adapts in the worst possible way. It normalizes the unknown. Cloud is just expensive. It's probably AI. It's probably security logging. It's probably the migration. The bill becomes weather, unpleasant, inevitable, and nobody's fault. Now, the after posture is not a dashboard upgrade. It's a subscription vending model with enforced preconditions. A subscription cannot be created until it declares intent in a machine-readable way. Who owns it, what budget it has, what environment it is, what it is allowed to deploy, and how escalation works. Ownership is not a wiki page. It's metadata tied to the subscription itself and referenced by policy, budget actions, and routing. This is where budget thresholds stop being polite notifications and start being governance interrupts. A budget at 50% isn't your failing. It's you are deviating from expected behavior early enough to still have options. At 75%, it escalates harder, not by spamming more people, by triggering the next step in the enterprise workflow, a ticket, a routing rule, an accountable owner who has to either justify the spend, fix the drift, or request an exception with an expiry. And yes, this is where the platform team will complain about friction. Good. Friction is how the system signals that a decision is happening. The goal isn't to prevent spending. The goal is to prevent unreviewed spending. A subscription vending model makes spend a conscious act again, because it forces the enterprise to answer the questions it avoided: who owns this, what is it for, and what happens when it grows. You also get a second-order effect that matters more than savings. Subscription sprawl collapses into a comprehensible structure. If every subscription has a named owner, a budget, and policy constraints aligned to purpose, then when an anomaly happens, the investigation path is short. It becomes days, not months. And the organization stops paying for unknown spend simply because it cannot allocate it. One caveat: don't pretend you can safely invent numbers here. The measurable outcome isn't we saved 37%. The measurable outcome is reduction of unknown spend categories, faster anomaly detection cycles, and fewer orphaned subscriptions that nobody can defend. And now the important transition: ownership alone doesn't solve allocation. If costs can't be attributed inside the subscription, down to product, environment, and lifecycle, then subscription ownership becomes a blunt instrument. You end up with one owner holding a bag of costs they can't explain, which is where the next lie shows up. Tagging fails because it's treated as etiquette. Tagging is where most FinOps programs go to die, because enterprises treat it like manners. Please tag your resources. Here's the tagging standard. Don't forget your cost center. That language reveals the real posture. They're asking for compliance the way you ask people to rinse their dishes. And then they act surprised when the sink fills up. Tagging is not etiquette. Tagging is financial identity. If a resource doesn't carry ownership metadata, then it is not a resource in a managed system. It's a liability with an invoice attached. And if allocation depends on tags, then the platform must refuse to create resources without them. Humans will not do this consistently. They are busy. They are optimizing for delivery. They will forget. They will type prod in one place and prod in another, and Azure will treat those values as different because tag values are case sensitive. So you don't get slightly imperfect tagging, you get allocation collapse. This is what the failure actually looks like in an enterprise. Half the estate has tags, half doesn't. The tagged half uses inconsistent keys and values. Cost center, cost center, cost center. Owner tags contain emails that belong to people who left. Environment tags say production, prod, PRD, and yes. Some teams tag at the resource group, some tag at the resource, some rely on Terraform modules that never got updated, some deploy through the portal and don't see the field at all, or they do, and they skip it because nothing stops them. Then finance shows up and asks for showback. Engineering says sure and produces a report that is 40% unallocated. The conversation immediately turns political, not because people are emotional, but because the data is unusable. Every chargeback discussion becomes an argument about whether the allocation rules are fair because the tags aren't reliable enough to be treated as truth. And this is where cost entropy hides again, in the fear of deletion. When a resource is untagged, nobody can confidently delete it because nobody can prove ownership. So the safest move is to keep paying. Untagged resources become financial fossils, expensive, old, and politically protected by ambiguity. The hard rule is simple. If you require a tag for allocation, then you require it for deployment. That means the platform refuses to create resources that don't carry the minimum financial identity, owner, environment, and a product or cost center dimension. Not because those tags are magical, but because without them, the organization cannot route accountability. And without routing, budgets and alerts become noise again. Azure gives you the enforcement mechanisms to do this. And most enterprises still don't because they confuse being strict with being hostile. Here's what most people miss. Enforcement doesn't have to be punitive. It has to be deterministic. Use Azure policy, use deny where you must, use modify where you can do it safely. Modify policies can auto-add baseline tags when they're missing or inherit tags from the resource group. And that's a useful pattern when you can rely on a well-constructed resource group boundary. But you can't treat inheritance as a substitute for governance. If teams can create arbitrary resource groups, then inheritance just moves the problem one layer down. So the correct posture is layered. Subscription-level tags establish ownership and budget responsibility. Resource group tags establish workload grouping and lifecycle intent. Resource tags handle exceptions and resource-specific dimensions. And yes, you will need a taxonomy, but keep it small, 6 to 8 tags that actually matter. Every extra tag is another chance for entropy. There's another uncomfortable truth hiding in tagging. People lie when tags are optional, not maliciously, operationally. If someone is blocked by a tag policy and they don't know the right value, they will pick something to get unblocked. That's why controlled vocabularies matter. That's why free text owner tags turn into unknown and TBD and later. So if you want tagging to work, you don't just enforce presence. You enforce meaning, allowed values, normalized casing, clear ownership mapping, a real taxonomy tied to the org structure you actually operate, not the one in your HR system. And once you do that, once the platform refuses untagged deployments, the entire FinOps conversation changes. Cost allocation stops being a quarterly negotiation. It becomes a boring mechanical process, which is exactly what you want, because boring means deterministic. Now, to make this concrete, the next scenario is where tagging failure becomes financial archaeology, untagged resources, no ownership, and weeks of arguing about who pays. Scenario 2, untagged resources and financial archaeology. Here's the scenario every enterprise recognizes, even if they pretend they don't. The cost spike shows up. Someone opens cost analysis. The top-line item isn't a clear application name. It's a storage account with a random suffix, or a log analytics workspace, or a database server named like a developer sneezed on the keyboard. and the tags are empty. In the before posture, tagging was recommended, which means it was ignored whenever delivery pressure was higher than etiquette. Finance can't allocate the cost. Engineering can't tell who owns the resource. The platform team can't safely delete it. So everyone does the only thing the enterprise teaches them to do. They investigate slowly, and they keep paying. This is what financial archaeology looks like in practice. First, someone tries to infer ownership from the resource name. That fails because naming standards are aspirational and time erodes them. Then they search activity logs for who created it. That fails in two common ways. The identity is a service principal shared by multiple pipelines, or the creator left the company. Then they look for connections, peering private endpoints, diagnostic settings, linked workspaces to determine impact. That becomes a graph problem, and graph problems don't finish in a meeting. So the resource survives, the cost continues. And a week later, you have a second untagged resource because the system learned nothing. Here's the key insight. Untagged resources don't just prevent allocation. They prevent intervention. Because deletion in an enterprise is a political act disguised as a technical act. And if you can't name the owner, you can't escalate. If you can't escalate, you can't get approval. If you can't get approval, you don't delete. The resource becomes too risky to touch, which is the most expensive category in Azure. Now, the after posture is not, we reminded people harder. It's enforced tagging as a deployment precondition. In production, the platform denies resource creation when the minimum financial identity is missing. Not later, not in a monthly report. At the moment of creation. That sounds harsh until you realize what it actually does. It forces the ownership conversation to happen while change is still cheap, when the engineer is still at their keyboard, when the pipeline can still fail fast, when the workload is still a proposal, not a dependency. And yes, you will use two different policy effects depending on what you're protecting. For baseline tags that are safe to apply universally, you use modify to add or normalize. A common pattern is to inherit owner and cost center from the subscription or resource group where that identity is already declared. That's how you avoid making every engineer type the same metadata 400 times. But for production workloads, you also use deny for missing or invalid tags, because allocation that depends on best effort is just a slower version of untagged chaos. This is where value standards matter. If the tag key exists, but the value is TBD, nothing improved. So you constrain values, controlled casing, allowed environments, approved cost centers, known owner formats. It's not bureaucracy, it's how you keep allocation deterministic. Now, the architecture move that makes this stick is to normalize tags to ownership boundaries. The subscription holds accountable ownership and budget responsibility. The resource group holds workload grouping and lifecycle intent. Individual resources only carry special cases because special cases multiply. If you don't build that hierarchy, tags become another entropy generator, endlessly debated, inconsistently applied, and never trusted. With enforcement in place, the operational behavior changes immediately. Engineering stops treating tags like paperwork because the platform refuses to deploy without them. Finance stops treating allocation like a quarterly negotiation because the data is complete. And leadership stops hearing "we can't tell" as an excuse because the system no longer allows "we can't tell" resources to exist in the first place. The measurable outcome isn't a fantasy percentage, it's something you can actually verify. The unallocated bucket shrinks towards zero. Not because people got better, because the control plane stopped accepting ambiguity. And once attribution becomes boring, showback and chargeback become boring too, which is the entire point. You want the cost conversation to be factual, not political. Now, there's a second-order consequence that shows up right after tagging gets enforced. Once teams can't hide behind ambiguity, they hide behind safety. They start over-provisioning by default, because cost is now visible, but operational risk still hurts more than the bill. That's the next failure mode: premium tiers and multi-region by reflex. Scenario 3, pass over-provisioning by default. Once tagging and ownership become real, teams lose the ability to hide, so they switch strategies. They hide behind safety. This is where PowerAS turns into a quiet budget murderer because PowerAS defaults are easy to justify and hard to unwind. A developer doesn't have to rack servers anymore. They click a tier, they pick redundancy, they enable the features that sound responsible, and nobody stops them because the platform treats premium as just another valid choice. In the before posture, over-provisioning isn't malicious. It's rational. Engineers are accountable for availability. They get paid for latency. They get blamed for downtime. They do not get praised for choosing the cheaper SKU. So when faced with uncertainty, they pick the tier that reduces operational risk. Premium database tier, just in case. Multi-zone, because what if? Multi-region, because the business might need it later. Diagnostic retention, because security might ask. Each of those decisions can be individually defensible. Collectively, they are financial entropy. And PaaS makes it worse because it's designed to abstract capacity decisions. That's the selling point. But abstraction doesn't remove cost, it removes friction. And when you remove friction in a large organization, Consumption expands until a boundary stops it. Most enterprises don't build that boundary. They treat PaaS like it's inherently optimized because Microsoft marketing implies that it is. It is not. It is a set of cost curves you must choose deliberately. So here's the real failure mechanism. Teams externalize the cost of safety. They buy safety with your budget and the platform lets them. The after posture isn't telling engineers to be more careful. It's forcing the platform to distinguish between environments and intents. Dev is not prod. Test is not prod. A sandbox is not a customer-facing service. If you allow the same SKU catalog everywhere, you are telling every team in every environment that the enterprise is comfortable paying for worst-case assumptions by default. That is not governance. That is surrender. The control is simple and it's always unpopular at first. Allow the SKUs per environment. In non-production, deny premium tiers unless there is an explicit exception. In production, don't deny everything, but constrain the choices to a set you can defend. Tiers that match real SLOs, actual throughput requirements, and resilience patterns you've agreed to pay for. This is where Azure policy stops being compliance and starts being cost engineering. You define policy rules that deny specific SKUs or deny specific features outside approved scopes. You restrict regions, you restrict redundancy options where they don't make sense. You can also enforce patterns. Prod databases must have backups configured, but dev databases must not be zone redundant, because zone redundancy in dev is just expensive cosplay. And yes, someone will argue that policy can't cover every PaaS configuration perfectly. That's true. But the point isn't perfect coverage. The point is removing default freedom where default freedom creates default overspend. Now the weird part, exceptions don't go away. They never do. So you treat exceptions as what they are. Entropy generators. An exception should be tracked, justified, and time-boxed. Not because the justification is morally important, but because time is the only thing that prevents an exception from becoming the new baseline. An exception without an expiry is policy rot. A premium SKU approval that lasts forever is not an approval. It's a quiet surrender that the platform will remember longer than your org chart. So the after posture includes an exception workflow. When a team needs a premium tier in a non-prod subscription, they request it. They state why. They pick an expiry date. The platform team grants an exemption at the policy layer, not by giving someone owner and hoping they behave. Then the exemption expires automatically, and the team has to renew it with intent or fall back to the baseline. That's how you stop premium sprawl from becoming permanent architecture. The outcome isn't just cost reduction, it's fewer emergency rollbacks. Because the enterprise stops discovering cost explosions after they happen, it discovers them at deploy time. The pipeline fails, the team sees the denial. They either adjust to the approved tier or escalate with a conscious decision. That is a healthier failure mode than an invoice time surprise. And it has a second-order benefit. Teams start designing for efficiency because the platform forces them to. If premium is harder to get, engineers invest in better indexing, better caching, better query patterns, better scaling strategies. Not because they became saints, but because the control plane changed the incentives. Now, there's one more place where this pattern becomes pathological: non-production. Because non-prod is where teams feel the least financial pain, so it becomes the landfill for overprovisioning, abandoned experiments, and temporary environments that never die. That's next. Scenario 4. Unbounded non-production spend. Non-production is where Azure budgets go to be embarrassed. In the before posture, dev and test are treated like free real estate. It's not prod, so nobody bothers with budgets. Nobody sets thresholds. Nobody defines what done means for an environment. And because nobody gets paged when dev costs spike, the platform quietly turns non-prod into the largest, least defended surface area of recurring spend. The failure pattern is always the same. A team spins up a full-stack environment for a sprint. It was supposed to be temporary. It isn't. Another team creates a parallel environment because the first one is messy and they don't want to touch it. Someone enables extra diagnostics just for troubleshooting and never turns it off. An internal demo needs more capacity, so the tier gets bumped up and never comes back down. Then a few of these environments get connected to shared services, log ingestion, private endpoints, hubs, and now even deleting the compute doesn't stop the bill because the dependencies keep running. And because non-prod is full of experimentation, nobody wants to be the person who deletes the wrong thing. So they don't delete anything. That's why non-prod becomes a cost landfill. It's the intersection of low accountability, high change velocity, and fear-driven retention. Those three forces always produce the same outcome. Resources outlive the work that justified them. This is also where the enterprise commits its most common cost lie. It's cheap compared to prod. That statement is usually true in isolation. It's just irrelevant. Non-prod isn't supposed to be cheap. It's supposed to be bounded. The point of non-prod is to support delivery with a known purpose and a known financial blast radius. If dev test can run indefinitely at any SKU with no budget and no lifecycle rule, then it stops being a delivery capability and becomes a parallel cloud estate with no governance. In other words, you built a second Azure environment inside your first one. So the after posture starts with the most boring but effective design move. separate non-production subscriptions, not resource groups, not tags, subscriptions. When non-prod lives inside the same subscription as prod, it inherits prod-level permissions, prod-level SKU freedom, and prod-level ambiguity. People will also use prod subscriptions for non-prod work temporarily because it's convenient. Separate subscriptions remove that pathway. They create a clean boundary where policies can be strict without breaking production. And now you do something enterprises almost never do. You treat non-prod budgets as aggressive by design. Non-prod budgets are not there to track. They are there to interrupt behavior early. 50% and 70% thresholds aren't warnings. They are scheduled friction. They force someone to explain why dev is burning through its expected envelope halfway through the cycle. And because it's non-prod, you can actually act. You can scale down. You can shut things off. You can delete environments. You can deny premium tiers. You can restrict regions. You can enforce short log retention. You can stop pretending that a dev environment needs the same resilience posture as customer-facing revenue. This is where automation stops being optimization and becomes enforcement amplification. The default posture in non-prod should be that things turn off unless someone actively keeps them on. Schedules, auto shutdown, lifecycle rules, whatever mechanism you use, the intent is the same. The platform should require explicit justification for idle runtime, because idle runtime is not innovation, it's just billing. Now, there's a predictable pushback here, but developers need flexibility. Yes, they do. That's why the goal isn't to ban spend. It's to encode purpose. If a team needs a larger environment for performance testing, fine, but it should happen through an approved path, time-boxed, budgeted, and visible. The platform can allow the exception while keeping the baseline strict. Without that, flexibility just becomes another word for architectural erosion. The outcome is also predictable, and it's measurable without inventing magic savings numbers. First, you reduce the number of long-lived idle environments because they get shut down by default. Second, you surface rogue environments early because budgets fire when spend deviates, and the deviation can't hide in a shared scope. Third, you force teams to make conscious choices about what they're paying for in non-prod, which changes behavior faster than any cost awareness campaign ever will. And here's the real payoff. The organization stops treating dev test as a junk drawer. Non-production becomes what it was supposed to be, an intentionally bounded delivery capability, not an unbounded parallel cloud estate. Now, even with clean non-prod boundaries, there's still one category of spend that loves to evade accountability: shared platform services. Because once you centralize networking, logging, and security, you've built a cost engine that every team depends on, but few teams can see. That's the next failure mode. Scenario 5, shared platform services with no cost signal. Shared platform services are where good intentions go to inflate quietly. In the before posture, the organization centralizes the expensive fundamentals: hub networking, firewalls, private DNS, log analytics, Sentinel, Defender plans, central key vault patterns, shared container registries, monitoring pipelines, maybe an enterprise API gateway. All of it is deployed for everyone, which sounds efficient, and it can be. But the cost signal usually disappears the moment it becomes shared, because those services are built to somewhere: a platform subscription, a connectivity subscription, a management subscription, a catch-all that's treated like a necessary tax. The application teams consume it, depend on it, and then optimize only their own resource groups because that's what they can see and what they're measured on. So the platform spend becomes a black hole with a justification attached. Here's the operational behavior that follows. Log ingestion grows because every team enables diagnostics at maximum verbosity temporarily, and nobody owns the retention curve. Network egress grows because architectures sprawl across regions, VNets peer like ivy, and traffic routes get fixed in ways that are correct for availability but catastrophic for cost. Security tooling grows because every new capability adds another build meter, and the platform team is incentivized to be safer, not cheaper. And because it's shared, nobody feels it. The app team doesn't feel the firewall bill. The platform team doesn't feel the app team's burst traffic. Finance sees a line item labeled platform and gets told it's foundational, which is true. It's also not an excuse for unbounded growth. This is the core governance failure of shared services. The enterprise funds a cost engine without attaching economic feedback to the consumers of that engine. Without feedback, consumption expands until it hits a crisis. Then the crisis is framed as Azure is expensive when it's actually shared services are unmetered internally. The after posture is not split everything into separate subscriptions. That's not the point. The point is to make shared costs legible and attributable, even when the underlying service must remain centralized. So the first step is explicit platform subscriptions with explicit accountability. Not the cloud team owns it. A named platform owner, a documented service catalog, a declared budget, early thresholds, the same governance rules you demanded for every workload subscription. Because shared services don't get a pass. They are the highest risk spend category in the entire estate. Then you add the piece everyone avoids: An allocation model, not perfect, not theoretically pure, just consistent, defensible, and repeatable. Some shared costs can be allocated by usage. Log analytics ingestion, sentinel data, firewall processing metrics in some cases, egress by workload if you collect flow logs and map them back to subscriptions or VNets. If you can measure consumption, allocate by consumption. But many shared costs can't be allocated cleanly without building an internal billing system that nobody wants. So you use proportional allocation where you must. Percentage by subscription spend, percentage by headcount, percentage by throughput class, whatever the business will accept as stable enough to create a feedback loop. The critical requirement isn't mathematical perfection. The requirement is that shared spend stops being invisible, because invisibility is what lets it grow without design review. This is also where showback and chargeback stop being philosophical arguments and become engineering inputs. If an application team sees that their architecture is driving a disproportionate share of log ingestion or cross-region traffic, the next design discussion changes. Suddenly, retention settings, sampling strategies, diagnostic scope, and topology are not abstract platform concerns. They're product decisions with financial consequences. And yes, some teams will complain that it's unfair. Good. Fairness complaints are often the first sign that cost signals are finally reaching the people making the trade-offs. Now, here's the part that most enterprises miss. Shared platform costs should be discussed as architectural constraints, not as bills. If you centralize logging, you must also centralize logging policy. Retention limits by environment, sampling defaults, what debug means in production, what data is worth paying to store. If you centralize networking, you must centralize topology standards, where traffic is allowed to flow, when cross-region is justified, what services are allowed to punch through the hub. Otherwise, the platform team becomes the custodian of a cost surface area that everyone can expand and no one can shrink. So the outcome of the after posture is not just predictability, it's earlier financial design decisions. Platform cost becomes a known, modeled component of architecture review. It becomes part of landing zone standards. It becomes part of exception governance. And most importantly, it stops being a mystery that shows up as a quarterly surprise. Now, once platform costs are legible, the enterprise usually makes its next mistake. They treat budgets like household trackers. That's next. Budgets are intent signals, not household trackers. Budgets are the most misunderstood FinOps control in Azure, and it's predictable why. Most organizations use them like a household expense app. Set a number, watch it, panic when it turns red, then do nothing meaningful because the month is basically over. That is not what budgets are for in an enterprise cloud. A budget is not a spending limit. Azure will not stop your workloads. Azure will not shut down your platform. A budget is a signal. It's the platform telling you that actual behavior is diverging from declared intent early enough to intervene. That distinction matters because budgets only work when they are attached to ownership and action. If a budget alert lands in a shared mailbox, it is theater. If it lands with an accountable owner who has both authority and consequence, it becomes governance. And if it lands early enough that changes are still cheap, it becomes an operational interrupt, not a finance postmortem. Most enterprises do the opposite. They set budgets late, they set them at the wrong scope, and they set thresholds that fire after the enterprise has already burned the money. The classic example is a monthly budget with a 90% alert. That alert triggers when the month is nearly finished, the spend has already happened, and your options are limited to eat it or break something. That's not a control, that's a notification that your control model failed. So budgets need 3 rules that are non-negotiable. First, align budgets to ownership boundaries. If a team owns a subscription, that subscription needs a budget. If a platform domain owns a shared services subscription, that subscription needs a budget. If you can't name the owner, you can't budget it, because there is no decision maker to receive the signal. Budgeting unowned spend is just documenting a problem you refuse to fix. Second, budgets must fire early. 50% and 70% thresholds aren't warnings. They are deliberately placed interrupts. They force the question, is this spend consistent with what we expected the subscription to do? If yes, then the organization updates its intent, budget, forecast, or constraints. If no, then the organization intervenes, right-sizing, disabling a feature, killing a runaway environment, or denying the next scale-out through policy. Budgets are not there to shame people. They're there to force a decision while the decision is still reversible. Third, budget alerts must trigger action, not email. Email is where accountability goes to die. If you want budgets to matter, route the alert into an escalation lane that produces a tracked artifact, a ticket in your ITSM tool, a message into the right team's channel with the owner tagged, an incident workflow for spend spikes that threaten financial controls. The point is not the tool. The point is that an alert becomes a queue with an owner and a response expectation. And yes, you can do this in Azure with action groups, webhooks, logic apps, and whatever workflow system your org already pretends is standardized. The mechanism is implementation detail. The model is what matters. Budgets trigger governance, not awareness. Now, there's a common objection. Budgets create alert fatigue. They do if you design them like spam. If you create budgets everywhere, at every scope with noisy thresholds, you will flood the organization with alerts that represent nothing. Then teams mute them and your budgets turn into background radiation. That's not a people problem, that's a design problem. Avoid alert fatigue by having fewer budgets with sharper scopes. Put budgets where there is real ownership and real financial exposure, subscriptions, platform domains, high-risk workloads like AI, data, egress-heavy architectures, and non-prod estates that love to sprawl. Don't budget every resource group in the estate because it feels thorough. Thoroughness is not control. Control is knowing which levers matter. Also, don't treat budget alerts as failures. A fired budget alert is not an incident by default, it's an anomaly indicator. Sometimes the anomaly is legitimate growth. A new workload, a migration phase, a seasonal spike. The alert still did its job because it forced the organization to acknowledge that intent changed. The worst outcome is not budget exceeded. The worst outcome is budget exceeded and nobody noticed until the invoice. So if budgets are signals, what are they signaling? They're signaling one of three things: drift, growth, or fraud. Drift means something is running that shouldn't be. Growth means your usage pattern changed and your budget model is stale. Fraud, in the broad sense, means an unexpected pathway is consuming resources, and cost is acting as the earliest signal something is wrong. Budgets can't tell you which one it is. That's your job. But budgets can tell you when to look. Early, reliably, at scale. Now, here's the catch. None of this works unless budgets have an accountability model behind them. Otherwise, you're just watching numbers move and calling it governance. Accountability models: showback, chargeback, and the real point. This is where every enterprise wastes 6 months, the religious war between showback and chargeback. Finance wants chargeback because it looks like control. Engineering wants showback because it looks like collaboration. Someone says, we can't do chargeback until tagging is perfect. And someone else says, we won't fix tagging unless we do chargeback. Then the meeting ends, nothing changes, and the platform keeps spending. That argument misses the point. Showback and chargeback are not ideologies. They are feedback mechanisms. The only thing that matters is whether the cost signal reaches the person who made the decision that created the spend fast enough for them to change the next decision. If the signal doesn't reach the decision maker, you don't have accountability, you have reporting. Showback is the early stage tool for building trust in the data. It says, here's what you consumed, here's the unit of allocation we agreed on, and here's how it maps to the org. No money moves, no budgets get hit. The goal is to remove the your numbers are wrong debate and replace it with boring acceptance. Because until the numbers are boring, nobody will accept chargeback. Chargeback is the enforcement tool for making cost a real constraint. It moves money, or at least it moves budget. It creates an economic consequence that forces teams to treat cloud consumption like any other resource they can't waste without trade-offs. But here's the uncomfortable truth. Neither showback nor chargeback fixes anything by itself. They are both downstream of governance. If you didn't enforce ownership boundaries, tagging, SKU constraints, and budget escalation, then chargeback just turns chaos into internal invoices. So you'll spend your year mediating disputes between teams about who pays for a shared log analytics workspace that nobody scoped correctly. That isn't accountability, that's internal billing theater. And showback without enforcement becomes wallpaper. People glance at it, nod, and keep deploying the same way because nothing in their system changes when the number goes up. So the sequence is deterministic. First, showback to establish legitimacy. Second, chargeback to establish consequence. And the real point of both is to create an economic feedback loop that closes fast. A mature organization doesn't pick showback or chargeback. It uses both deliberately at different stages for different kinds of spend. Now, accountability isn't just who pays, it's who is accountable for the guardrails. And this is where enterprises get sloppy, because they pretend accountability is a cultural concept. It isn't, it's a design requirement. In a real operating model, the FinOps team or cloud economics function, call it whatever your org chart tolerates, should be accountable for defining the guardrails and the measurement model. App teams should be responsible for staying inside those guardrails, including tagging compliance and cost-aware design decisions. Finance should be consulted for budgeting, allocation rules, and the mechanics of internal charge. Leadership should be informed, not asked to resolve the same argument every month. That's not bureaucracy. That's how you stop ownership from dissolving into everyone's problem, which is just a polite way to say nobody's problem. And there's another shift happening that enterprises keep ignoring. FinOps is no longer just cloud. The FinOps Foundation's newer Cloud Plus framing and scopes idea exists because spending doesn't stay contained. Cloud leads to SaaS. SaaS leads to licensing sprawl. AI leads to token burn and GPU builds that make your old VM arguments look adorable. If you build an accountability model that only works for VM spend, you're building yesterday's governance. So the practical posture is scopes. Apply accountability where spend concentrates. Cloud scope, subscriptions, tagging, budgets, policy enforcement. AI scope, model usage, token forecasts, stricter anomaly response because costs can spike fast. Shared services scope, allocation rules that make platform spend legible, even when it can't be perfectly metered. You don't need to boil the ocean. You need to stop pretending a single model fits everything. The simplest version is this: accountability must follow decision rights. If engineering can choose the SKU, engineering must see the cost signal. If the platform team controls diagnostics defaults, the platform team must own the retention economics. If leadership demands multi-region resilience, leadership must accept the price tag as a design decision, not a surprise invoice. Once that operating model is real, showback and chargeback stop being arguments. They become implementation details. And now the transition that matters. Once accountability exists, enforcement has to live where the decisions happen, not in meetings, in the control plane. The enforcement stack, policy, RBAC, budgets, deployment stamps. So if cost is an authorization outcome and accountability is the feedback loop, then enforcement is the only part that actually survives contact with reality. Meetings don't enforce, slide decks don't enforce, cost awareness doesn't enforce, the control plane enforces. And the enforcement stack in Azure is not complicated. It's just unpopular because it removes freedom people already got used to. Start with Azure Policy because it's the closest thing Azure has to an authorization compiler for cost intent. Policy is where you encode the non-negotiables, required tags, allowed regions, allowed SKUs, and configuration baselines that have real financial impact. Deny is the blunt instrument. Modify is the quieter one. Deploy, if not exists, is the you're going to pay for this anyway, so we're going to standardize it move. The key is that policy runs at deploy time. It doesn't ask for cooperation. It evaluates intent and either materializes capacity or refuses it. That means you stop trying to convince teams to behave and you start designing the platform so behavior has boundaries. Now, this is where most enterprises sabotage themselves. They treat policy exemptions like kindness. Exemptions are not kindness. They are entropy generators. Every exemption should be visible, justified, time-boxed, and reviewed, because if you can't explain why something bypassed the rules, you didn't make an exception. You created a second rule set that only some people know exists. Next layer is RBAC, because policy without permission design is just a guardrail around a highway exit nobody controls. Most organizations have a contributor problem. They hand out broad contributor at subscription scope because it makes delivery easy, and then they act surprised when spend is unbounded. Contributor is not empowerment. It is a spend authorization primitive. If a team can create resources, they can create cost. If they can assign roles, they can create new spend pathways. And if they can deploy without a cost signal, they can externalize the consequences. So RBAC needs two outcomes. First, the people making deployment decisions must be able to see cost management reader, or equivalent visibility for engineering leads and platform owners. If they can't see cost trends, budgets, and anomalies, they are operating blind, and blind systems drift. Second, deploy authority and spend accountability can't be the same unmanaged blob. That doesn't mean you create a bureaucracy of approvals. It means you design roles so the enterprise can tell who is allowed to do what and who is responsible when it goes wrong. And yes, that often means pipelines and managed identities get narrowed permissions, not contributor, because it works. Because it works is how cost entropy gets funded. Third layer is budgets, but not as tracking, as escalation engines. Budgets are the interrupt system that tells you intent and reality diverged. They don't stop spend. They route attention. And if they aren't wired into action, tickets, paging, escalation channels, they are a compliance checkbox that produces email. Budgets should exist at subscription scope because that's where ownership is legible and blast radius is bounded. They can also exist at higher scopes for rollups, but the place where action happens is where someone can actually change something without a committee. And budgets should fire early because the platform needs time to respond. 50 and 70% thresholds are not conservative. They are practical. They're the only way to catch drift while you still have options. Now, the fourth layer is the part people ignore because it feels like platform engineering, not FinOps. Deployment stamps, guarded environments, standard patterns. Call them what you want. The idea is the same. You stop letting every team invent their own cost model by accident. A stamp is a pre-approved, pre-constrained deployment pattern, networking, logging, diagnostics, SKU baselines, scaling rules, retention settings, and whatever else always turns into surprise spend. When teams deploy through the stamp, they inherit the constraints and the defaults, and the platform doesn't relitigate the same cost mistakes 400 times. This is how you scale autonomy without scaling chaos, because you're not restricting teams to one architecture. You're restricting them to architectures with known cost behavior. And then you do one more thing enterprises avoid. You make exceptions expensive in process, not in politics. If a workload needs to break the stamp, fine. But it does so through a visible exception path with an expiry. That keeps the baseline clean, and it forces special cases to prove they're still special every time the clock runs out. So the enforcement stack is simple. Policy defines what is allowed, RBAC defines who can attempt it, budgets define when reality diverges, stamps define the default pathways, so divergence is rarer, and the outcome is the only thing that matters. Cost becomes an enforced design decision, not a post-mortem artifact. Now the question isn't what tools should we use, the question is, can you roll this out in a way that survives organizational pressure? That's next. The 90-day rollout. from surprise bills to enforced intent. This only works if you treat it like a platform rollout, not a finance initiative. 90 days is enough time to change the system behavior. If you stop negotiating with entropy and start removing its pathways. Days 1 to 30. Define ownership boundaries and make them real. Lock in your subscription strategy. What is prod, what is non-prod, what is platform, what is sandbox, and who owns each of those scopes. Then define the minimum tagging taxonomy that represents financial identity. Owner, environment, and cost center or product. Keep it small and enforceable. At the same time, stand up initial showback with whatever accuracy you currently have, because the point in month 1 is to surface where you can't allocate and why. That gap is your backlog, not your shame. Days 31 to 60, move from visibility to enforcement. This is where you start using Azure policy like it's meant to be used, to stop the platform from accepting ambiguity. Deny untagged production deployments. Use modify where you can safely add baseline tags or inherit them, but don't confuse auto-tagging with governance. Implement budgets at subscription scope with early thresholds. Route alerts into an action path, not a mailbox. Then restrict SKUs by environment. Non-prod doesn't get premium by default, and regions don't sprawl because someone felt adventurous in the portal. Day 61 to 90, wire escalation and institutionalize exceptions. Build the workflow. Budget alert creates a ticket. It lands with a named owner. It has an SLA and it has an outcome. Justify, remediate, or request an exception with an expiry. Then formalize shared platform accountability. If platform subscriptions aren't budgeted and allocated, you're funding a black hole. Finally, introduce deployment stamps. Guarded patterns that encode cost-bounded defaults so teams stop reinventing expensive architectures accidentally. The deliverables at day 90 are boring on purpose: a reference architecture for subscriptions and environments, a policy starter pack, an accountability model that survives org charts, and an operating cadence that doesn't depend on heroics. And avoid the predictable anti-patterns. Optimize first, tag later, dashboards as governance, and exceptions without expiry. Those are just different ways of asking entropy to be polite. Cost discipline is enforced autonomy. Cloud becomes expensive when unbounded choice meets zero accountability, and Azure will happily bill you for every unowned decision you allowed. If you want predictable spend, stop treating FinOps like reporting and start enforcing financial intent in the control plane, subscription boundaries, policy constraints, budget escalation, and time-boxed exceptions. If you want the next layer, how to design the authorization graph so cost controls don't erode over time, watch the next episode. Subscribe if you're done paying for ambiguity.